Derbyshire.
He's won the vote tonight, but Conservative rebels on the right warn Rishi Sunak his Rwanda plan remains on borrowed time. Can the PM ever get planes in the air to Kigali? And what chance he can keep his fractured party in one piece? The ayes have it for the emergency Rwanda bill, but many of the don't knows warn they'll become no's next time if the PM doesn't toughen it up. So what might the new year bring for Rishi Sunak? And does tonight's vote actually mean he's in with a chance of getting Rwanda flights off the ground? We'll speak to two Tory MPs on different wings of the party, with different views on how this bill should progress. Can the legislation go any further, as some Conservatives are now demanding, and what would it mean under international law? Former Supreme Court Justice Lord Sumption is here. And Keir Starmer's been trying to say his party has fundamentally changed 4 years on from a brutal election defeat back in 2019. What's their plan to stop the small votes? Also tonight, an investigation from Barking and Dagenham. A Labour council hailed for its record on regeneration, but now accused of overcharging tenants in affordable housing and ignoring safety concerns.
I feel hopeless. I feel like we've been used, ultimately invisible to the council, who have no regard for how we feel about where we live.
And we will look through tomorrow's front pages with the Whitehall editor of the Financial Times, Lucy Fisher. Good evening. It's been a tense few days for the Prime Minister, but tonight's victory on his Safety of Rwanda bill brought some respite for Rishi Sunak. A majority of 44 MPs passed the legislation through its second reading in the House, giving the Prime Minister some breathing space as the parliamentary Christmas break looms. For all the talk of this vote being on a knife edge and Tory rebels looking to give Downing Street a bloody nose, just 24 Tories actively chose to abstain on the bill, not a single one voting against the government. Some of the MPs within the wing of the party most likely to rebel did actively vote with the government tonight. But the Prime Minister remains on a warning that MPs could vote it down next time if they don't get what they want. Those on the left of the party, of course, have warned an inch further to the right and they'll withdraw their support. So has Rishi Sunak's can just been kicked down the road then? And can he ever do enough to get all of his party on side on this, his flagship policy? Nick is here. So where does Rishi Sunak stand tonight?
Well, Victoria, it was a tense start for the day for the Prime Minister, but relief tonight after that comfortable win, though, of course, there were those abstentions from the right of the Conservative Party. After that vote, I spoke to MPs from across the party. From Loyalists, a very clear message to the right: row in behind the Prime Minister and focus on the general election. From the right, this battle is not over. They said they had assurances from the Prime Minister that he is prepared to tighten up this bill when it goes to the committee stage. And they say if that doesn't happen, they reserve the right to vote it down when it has its final vote in the Commons before it goes to the House of Lords. What might happen? Well, as ever, it's down to numbers. I estimate there were 24 active abstentions by Conservative MPs. That means they sat on the government benches as the vote went on to ostentatiously say we're not voting. If you turned those 24 votes into no's, then that wouldn't quite overturn the Prime Minister's majority, but it would get close. The abstainers, they say, no, we had 38 abstainers, and if you turn those votes, those abstentions into a no vote, then that would comfortably overturn Rishi Sunak's majority. But turning an abstention into a vote against is a very big step and is not a given. So we have a confident Prime Minister tonight, but still a long way to go. Back from the brink, if in fact there was ever a brink. A comfortable win for Rishi Sunak keeps alive a main election offering, a law designed to guarantee resettlement flights to Rwanda.
The ayes to the right, 313. The noes to the left, 269.
Not even close. The Prime Minister won his first parliamentary vote on the bill by 313 to 269. Not one Conservative MP voted against the bill. Around 24 actively abstained. All MPs will now have a chance to table amendments as the committee stage takes place on the floor of the House. Labour is unlikely to support any Tory amendments, so a potential moment of jeopardy is the third reading, the last vote before it goes to the Lords. Relief in Downing Street tonight after Rishi Sunak won, and he won comfortably. All a different atmosphere at the beginning of the day when the Prime Minister hosted Conservative MPs on the right in Downing Street. He then came here for further meetings. But just after 5 o'clock, you could see the whips. They were smiling. They knew by then that they were going to be OK. One said to me, "I've written quite a few cheques for quite a few bypasses."
Well, I think the government is pleased to have won this vote by such a solid majority. Clearly there was fevered speculation the government might not do so well, but 44 is a very respectable result. And this piece of legislation is the most comprehensive and radical piece of immigration legislation this Parliament has ever passed.
A key figure on the Tory right, now known as the Five Families, says the government still needs to move.
Despite it being a very hard three-line whip, 38 Conservative MPs abstained, the vast bulk of whom are from what you guys now call the Five Families. So we did that on the strict understanding that we would then table amendments in January. The Prime Minister said he would entertain tightening up the bill. We'll table amendments to do exactly that, and we expect those amendments to be respected. If they're not, we reserve the right to vote against the bill at third reading.
Relief amongst loyalists and a message to the right.
The government can't be blackmailed into doing stuff, can it? I mean, the government has its legislation, it wants to get it through. I'm sure it will accept helpful amendments, but if the amendments are not helpful, then they won't get accepted by the government. That's the way it works. And of course, at third reading, they'll be perfectly entitled to vote against the bill at third reading. But then again, they will have to go back to their constituents and say, oh, by the way, I voted against a bill that has the intention of trying to restrict illegal immigration into the UK. That is a difficult and nuanced argument to make with your constituents.
Now, there was an impression from some of the so-called Five Families groups on the Conservative right that there would be a rebellion. What happened?
Okay, I'm part of two of those groups, and actually I'm a big fan of the Conservative Party being conservative in a thoughtful, compassionate way. So I was part of that. I supported the government today because, look, we're less than a year from a general election. We cannot be demanding massive changes in policy so close to an election.
Yeah.
Labour was unimpressed.
Well, we had total Tory chaos for days, a civil war erupting in the Conservative Party, and it looks like that's going to carry on into the new year, and it's letting the country down. And we've got as well at the heart of this failing Rwanda plan that means you've got now £400 million of taxpayers' money being sent to Rwanda with not a single person being sent, and more Home Secretaries sent to Rwanda.
A breather for the Prime Minister for now. But we will see the Tory sceptics again in the new year, facing an emboldened Rishi Sunak.
Well, just after the vote, I spoke to Ben Bradley, Tory MP for Mansfield and part of the so-called Common Sense group of Conservatives, which is seen as on the right of the party. He voted with the government for the bill. Does he now want it, though, toughened up?
I want us to deliver the toughest possible stance that we can, because we've promised for a long time that we're going to deliver not just sending illegal migrants to Rwanda to be processed, but stopping the boats. This is a key part of that. It's one part of it. But we've got to work through that process now over the next couple of months to get it as strong as it can be. But today is, in principle, do we want to send illegal migrants to be processed in Rwanda? Yes, we do, because we promised it for a long time.
But if it goes any further, then the Prime Minister risks losing the people on the left of your party and, he says, risks Rwanda pulling out.
Well, it's a really tight margin for error from that perspective, and I do think the problem here in some ways is not the government, it's the parliamentary party, in the sense of we have clear disagreements within the party on this, and the government's got to try and land something that is both deliverable and will get through the Commons. So at some point our ideal scenario has to meet with reality and pragmatism, and we have to deliver the strongest possible bill that we can. I don't know whether it is today, I'm not a lawyer, but we'll spend the next couple of months examining that and make sure that it is.
I mean, you will have heard Robert Jenrick again today, a man who resigned as Immigration Minister just a week or so ago, saying, look, this bill just isn't going to work. I mean, can you guarantee to your constituents that flights are going to be taken off before the next election with people on board to Rwanda?
Well, at this stage, no. I hope that they will. The Prime Minister and the legal team in government think that they will. And I have to say that with the appointments since Robert's resignation, Michael Tomlinson, Robert Courts, people I respect a great deal, who are lawyers and probably know more about this than I do. But we'll spend the next couple of months doing that. And I will be pushing for the strongest possible version. I'll be testing to make sure that it is that, as far as I can see. And then we hope we can get flights away.
So you're saying the fight's not over, is it? I mean, for the Prime Minister, the battle is not over. It's just been kicked to the start of next year.
Well, in practical terms, we'll come back in January, right? And we'll vote on all of this again. Hopefully, we'll do that in a more informed way because we'll have spent that time looking through it. And fundamentally, as Robert says, he's right to say, it's not just about getting a symbolic flight away. It's about providing a genuine deterrent that it doesn't mean we can send thousands of people to Rwanda. It means people don't come in the first place. That's the key thing that we're trying to achieve.
Well, on the numbers then, when you look at what it is likely to achieve, if indeed it does work, it passes and it works, at most, you're going to get 200 to 300 people being sent to Rwanda each year when the asylum backlog is 160, 170,000. That's less than 0.5% of the backlog.
Yeah.
Big deal.
Well, that's the point, right? This is not the sum total of the government's response to illegal migration. The point of this is not to send everybody who applies to Rwanda.
No,
the point of this...
It's a tiny
number. And that's why we need to make sure that people stop coming. Because if you start to get into the realms of 3,000 or 4,000 people are going to come every week forever, it's not manageable, is it? And we all know that. That's the point of all of this. So in order to get people to stop thinking that this is a place that they can come and stay, we've passed legislation that says you can't stay here. We need somewhere to send people. That's what Rwanda is about, not about shipping thousands of people to Rwanda, but making clear that if you arrive here, you're not going to be able to stay here.
And you think sending 200 people a year, if it works, is going to deter people?
It's one part of a wider set of measures, right? And we've got all sorts of things in place.
Don't you think if you'd made that massive journey and managed to cross the channel and get to France, rather, you're going to go, well, I might be one of 200 possibly sent to Rwanda, so I'm going to risk it?
I don't know. I'm not somebody who comes across in a boat, but at the same time, we have to do everything that we can. If there was a dead simple solution, I'd love to say, right, turn the boats around, drag them back to France. But we're not in a position legally to do that. We've got to work in a pragmatic sense to find the toughest measures we can find that will be delivered through here. And Rwanda have said, if you start to break international rules, we won't do this. So there's a very fine line for us to tread, and that's where we need to be.
So far, the scheme has cost £290 million. No one's been sent there, as we all know. The Home Secretary confirmed another 50 million will be given to Rwanda in 2025 and more in 2026. How is that value for money for taxpayers?
I don't think any of this is value for money. I'm not here to say the government's doing a brilliant job on illegal migration. It's a mess, and we need to make sure that although relatively in the rest of the world, we've come down by 30%, much of mainland Europe has nearly doubled in the same time, my constituents don't want to hear, oh, we're not as bad as Italy. They want us to deal with it. And clearly it's not value for money. Paying £8 million a day is not value for money. That's why we need to deliver as strong a bill as we can in a suite of measures that are as strong as we can, including tackling all this upstream to stop them coming in the first place. So this is just part of it. It's kind of a symbolic argument today, right, about whether Rwanda or not to Rwanda. But there's a big picture here where we just need to be absolutely clear that you cannot come here and stay.
Why has it been so fractious and so difficult for the Prime Minister in the last few days?
Well, we all have different views, right? And the nature of parties of government is that they are broad parties with a broad range of views. I am from a constituency that has, I think, a very, very strong view that this illegal migration situation is not fair or right.
I know, but why has it been hard for your boss?
Well, because equally on the other end of the spectrum, there are people who don't feel the same way, and that's a difficult challenge. We've been in government for 13 years. You've got a parliamentary party that has been built in all different directions, in different elections by different leaders. You might argue that it's kind of ungovernable in the sense of different views, and this situation suggests it's certainly not easy to govern. And that's why we've got to, as I say, pragmatism's got to meet ideology at some point. What is the strongest that we can deliver versus what is perfect, because perfect is not going to get through here.
Thank you very much for talking to Newsnight.
All right.
Well, Damien Green was Deputy Prime Minister under Theresa May and now heads up the One Nation Conservatives group on the left of the party. I asked him whether there is another battle coming at the next stage of this bill.
Well, there may be. I think one of the significant things, the most significant thing that's happened today is that the government won quite big. It's been one of those febrile, gossipy, exciting days in Westminster. But actually, at the end, the government had a majority of 44, which is pretty solid.
But today was the easy day, really. It was about the principle of the thing, wasn't it?
But the principle of the thing is important. Just looking at, there was a Labour amendment first and then the government vote. For the Labour amendment, which of course all Conservatives would vote against, there were 337. For the government vote, there were 313. So that means 24 of my colleagues decided to abstain. That's not that many, that's fewer than people thought.
But how is the Prime Minister going to bring together, reconcile the two sides of the party? Because people on the right, and I spoke to them a little earlier, want this bill to go further. And that would mean you and people in your side of the party wouldn't be able to support it.
Well, we have said all along, and are still saying, that if the amendments are introduced and supported by the government that would break our international obligations or weaken Britain's commitment to the rule of law, then yes, we would vote against them, and so I suspect would the House of Commons more widely. So I don't think the government should go down that track, and I don't think they need to go down that track now. I think they can say, you know, we all know, I'm not being foolish about this, there are a difference of view within the Conservative Party about how best to make this legislation effective. But actually, on today's vote, the government has more or less managed the narrow landing strip that it's aiming at, and so it should stick to that landing strip.
But you make it sound like it's going to be simple at the third reading. I mean, it's not, is it?
Well, I think if it goes through its committee stage, I mean, there are always small amendments, but nothing significant, with nothing changed, and it's got a majority of 44 today, then I would hope that third reading would go through reasonably easily, and you know, that's very important because obviously that sends a signal to the House of Lords where it goes next. So I think the government ends the day stronger than it looked like at the start.
But you've still got people on the right saying this bill needs to be pulled because it's not going to work, because it will allow too many individuals to make appeals against being removed to Rwanda.
Well, in the end, people who say that, and I disagree with them, have to convince enough people in the House of Commons that they're right. And today's lesson is that they haven't. There aren't that many. So I think...
So be sceptical about what Mark Francois of the European Research Group says when he says they're all on the right, sticking together and voting collectively?
Well, I just observed tonight's vote, and I mean, I don't know how many people were at their meeting, so I can't comment on the numbers, but what I can do is count the people who voted. And that, you know, as I say, that looks like there were 24 of them.
So not as many as one might have been expecting?
Well, I think that's right. I think through the day people were talking about 50, 60, 70 or something like that. But you know, people's views change through the process of legislation going through the House. So I'm sure the government whips won't be in any way complacent or won't think this is a done deal. But I think, you know, and I would appeal to my colleagues on the right of the party that it is clearly in the interest of the party as a whole that we show some unity in the early months of next year.
How harmful would it be to the government if no flights take off before the next general election?
Well, it's clearly it's an important commitment and we want to see it. I think actually what people want to see is the boats, the numbers coming across, massively reduced. The government has had some success, and it's interesting that all this Westminster row we've been having actually disguises to some extent the fact that the numbers coming across are going to be a third down this year from last year. In other circumstances, that would be seen as a triumph, and if we get another third down next year, that would be great as well, because it's a terrible way to get to this country. It's dangerous and all the things we know. So I think that the Rwanda scheme, everyone says, will act as a deterrent. So that's good, but it's one of a suite of measures the government needs to be taking, including more effective action on the French beaches and so on, which between them can continue to drive down the numbers coming illegally in this way.
Thank you very much for talking to Newsnight.
Thank you.
Well, in the pitch to his own MPs to convince them his Rwanda plan will get flights off the ground, Rishi Sunak has cited the former Supreme Court Justice Lord Sumption as believing the bill will work. And obviously, as you can see, he's right here with us this evening. Hello to you. Welcome to Newsnight. So, Mr. Sunak mentioned you at his press conference, saying you thought this bill would work, but you also think it will break international law. Just explain that for our audience.
It'll work because the English courts the British courts will do what Parliament tells them to do. It successfully blocks off delaying litigation, except in one area, which concerns people who are unable to say and produce convincing evidence that although Rwanda may be safe in general, there's some particular characteristic that they have that makes it unsafe for them. That's the only window that they can get through. It's a relatively narrow window. What's more, any proceedings have to be finished within 30 days, and there are restrictions on the right of the courts to give make interim injunctions to preserve the position pending the hearing. They're not allowed to do so unless there is serious and irrevocable harm in sending them to Rwanda pending the decision. So it's a relatively tight bill. Why is it contrary to international law? I don't think it's contrary to international law to send people to Rwanda, because the new treaty essentially stops them from being sent back to their home countries if they fail in their asylum claims or decide not to make one. But it is contrary to international law, to both the Refugee Convention and the Human Rights Convention, to block people off from access to the courts and not allow them to argue the contrary to what Parliament has now declared.
So when Amnesty say this is a sad assault on the rule of law and the protection of human rights in this country, what's your assessment?
It's clearly contrary to human rights. The Act expressly requires the courts to disregard the Human Rights Convention, although it's a treaty to which the United Kingdom is party. It's absolutely clear about that.
So what do you think of that?
Well, I think that one should observe treaties that one is party to. Whether one remains party to them is another question. But while we remain party to the Human Rights Convention, we must observe it. And sooner or later, there may be a clash with the Strasbourg Court of Human Rights, which will pay absolutely no attention to domestic UK legislation. Which
will anger some Conservative MPs.
It may well produce, depending on what orders they make, a crisis in our relations with the Council of Europe and the Strasbourg Court.
There's talk, obviously, of amendments being made to this bill to potentially even further limit individuals' rights to appeal. What are the implications of that? Well, the government doesn't have much room to manoeuvre because they risk Rwanda walking away and the whole deal collapsing if they get rid of the one significant loophole, which is Clause 4. So they've got to retain that in some shape or form. What I suspect they might do if they want to make concessions to the Conservative right is to include a definition clause which rules out the arguments that migrants might want to make to show that they have personal circumstances that bring within the exception or that they would suffer irrevocable harm. That's a technique that's already to some extent been employed in the Illegal Migration Act, which was passed in July, and I suspect that they may be tempted to increase those definitions to narrow the position. You don't sit in the Lords. I don't. You know people who do. And maybe even some of your best friends are Lords who sit in the Lords. That doesn't give me any insight into what they're likely to do. But I guess that they will radically... What do you think they'll do? I think that the likelihood is that there will be radical amendments in the Lords. It will then go back to the Commons, where the government will presumably try to reinstate all the original provisions. It will then go back to the Lords a second time. I suspect that at that point the Lords will give up the fight, but I'm speculating. So you expect it to become law? I do. Thank you very much for being with us on Newsnight and talking to our audience and for your insight. Thank you. Well, Labour have been looking to exploit Tory divisions over tonight's vote, as you might expect. In a speech marking 4 years since the 2019 election, Keir Starmer told an audience in Milton Keynes that Labour would reduce migration without the psychodrama. Speaking to the expectations of more turmoil today, Buckinghamshire had not been the original venue for that speech, but it was relocated late on to allow the Labour leader to get back to London for tonight's votes. And on migration, he too said the small boats had to be stopped. Jonathan Reynolds is here. He's Labour's Shadow Business Secretary. Welcome to you. Good evening, Mr Reynolds. So is Labour going to pledge to the electorate ahead of the election that you're going to stop the boats?
Yeah, we want this problem stopped. This is a serious problem, but for us, we want things that will make a difference. We don't want these gimmicks. And with Rwanda, it has always been the case that it's not going to work. I mean, you saw when you challenged Conservative colleagues there, about 100 people. It's a tiny amount of the problem, even if it goes ahead and the idea it's a deterrent doesn't stand up. But the cost of this is indefensible. And £400 million it's up to today. The only people they've sent to Rwanda are 3 different Home Secretaries. There's been actually no progress on the issue. It's not the right way to do it. And if you take that resource, which is our policy, put it into the criminal activity, stopping that is at the heart of this, do a proper returns agreement, deal with the actual problem, process the claims.
Let's talk about some of those specifically.
Yeah.
Smash the gangs. How is that any more than just a gimmick?
Well, because you've now got such a significant amount of resource being wasted on this policy that you've got something you can put in.
So that money's been spent.
Well, not all of it. Not all of it. So we learnt today in the debate there's extra tranches of money in the subsequent years. But I do think it's fair to say, look, this is what the government is spending the money on. This is how we would do it differently.
Right. You want to employ thousands more civil servants to process claims. The vast majority of those arriving in small boats so far have been granted asylum. About 75% have been given leave by the Home Office to remain here. If you speed up the process, do you not then encourage more people to come?
Well, I don't think that is the biggest draw, no, but I think the problem we're trying to address here is the country is spending £8 million a day on hotel accommodation because obviously if you haven't processed those claims, you can't integrate people into Britain or return them if they shouldn't be here. And so rather than spend that money on the hotel bill, spending it on people actually doing the claims, all we're talking about is processing claims at the same rate they were being processed a few years ago. So it's not some insurmountable problem that we can't somehow get back to, but that's at the core of the problem. And actually, look...
But I can't... There's nothing that you've said yet, really, that tells me that you, if you win the next election, are going to stop the boats. We spoke today to Kevin Saunders, the UK's former Border Force chief. He says British governments have been trying to crack down on people smugglers since Tony Blair was in power. And it's really, really difficult. It's easy to say, really difficult to do in practice.
Of course, this is a difficult problem, but the problem has got worse in the last few years based on how slowly and inefficient those claims have been processed. There's been huge costs, huge pressures caused on where to put, which isn't fair on people themselves if they do have a right to be in the United Kingdom and we should be granting them asylum. It's not fair on them to have them waiting in hotels or in a halfway house till they've got the chance to actually have their claim assessed and processed. So let's not say it's a problem to get back to a more efficient system, but yes,
it's whether you can or not. That's the thing.
This is a serious problem, but I think, to have this kind of thing where it's obviously not going to work even if the government gets its way, and it's always been about a gimmick, it's always been about this so-called wedge issue. The surprise has been...
Let me ask you about your stuff,
internals
if I
in
may.
the Conservative Party have been wedged.
Right, you talk about returns agreements with other countries. I just wonder if that's naive, that other countries will simply go, yeah, send our citizens back to us. We've done that with Albania, yes, and it appears to have worked. But two of the most frequent nationalities on small boat crossings are Iranians and Afghans. Are you going to be reaching agreements with the Taliban?
Look, certain countries, I accept your point that it is harder, but the fact that you've correctly referenced there, the Albanian agreement, is exactly the kind of real, practical, a thing that actually makes a difference. Look around the world. No schemes like Rwanda exist as ways to tackle a serious problem. You've got to get into the serious business of negotiating with other countries, of investing in crime and policing to make sure you're bringing that down, and having to make sure you've got a system in your own country that processes those claims efficiently and fairly.
Labour's talked about getting new migration down to 200,000 a year, legal migration, by the end of its first term in government. Is that going to be a cast iron pledge?
Well, look, I wouldn't put a figure on it. I think
but
clearly
your colleague has.
Well, look, I think the level of net immigration will always reflect to some degree what's going on in your economy. We do think immigration has to come down. We have, for instance, got policies around the care sector to drive up standards.
Let me ask you about that 200,000 figure. Was Darren Jones wrong to put a figure on it?
No, look, I don't think any colleague has got this wrong, but I think I wouldn't put a specific figure on it.
So is it 200,000 or
no,
not?
there's not a specific target on that. We do think immigration is too high at the minute. We think it has to come down. That's entirely consistent with recognising the huge benefits that immigrants bring to this country. But clearly there are failings, for instance, in the care sector, where we're not training people, not giving people the terms and conditions they need, and we're having to import a workforce to it. And that shouldn't be the only answer to labour and skill shortages.
Thank you very much for talking to our audience. Thank you. Jonathan Reynolds from Labour. Now, Labour has promised the biggest... Sorry, this is a totally different story now. Labour has promised the biggest boost to affordable housing for a generation if they get into number 10. But in one London borough, hailed for its record on regeneration, residents and the local Labour MP are angry. Barking and Dagenham Council has been accused of overcharging people living in affordable and social housing thousands of pounds for services that hardly happened, and also ignoring safety warnings about collapsing balconies. The borough's council leader has also received tens of thousands of pounds of gifts and hospitality, a lot of it from companies involved in lucrative construction projects. The council's told Newsnight it's proud of its record on affordable housing, Other companies are responsible for building defects and all gifts are registered in the proper way. Here's Joe with his exclusive report.
It's been hailed as one of the best boroughs in London for regeneration. Over the past 5 years, around a fifth of all the capital's affordable housing has been built in Barking.
When I became leader of the council, we got straight to work. Together, we've built over 2,000 council-built homes.
And the council's Labour leader is standing to be Barking's MP on his record of house building.
Vote Darren Rodwell for Barking.
Darren Rodwell is the housing spokesman for the local government association. But not all residents at one of the borough's biggest new estates, Weaver's Quarter, are impressed by his record.
So this garden area is being charged at about £15,000 a year.
Just this one?
Just this one on its own, £15,000.
Matt Lismore bought his two-bed shared ownership flat here 4 years ago. The service charges have been rising ever since.
£15,000 a year. Essentially that covers 20 grass cuts a season, which you can see this grass simply isn't in any condition to need that. Keeping the plants alive, keeping all these areas free from debris, keeping the patio stones clean. And as you can see, it simply isn't being done. This to me feels like an egregious, overestimation. It seems like a fictitious charge.
A lot of the plants here are dead, there isn't much grass, but the council says 3 staff work 2 days a week maintaining the gardens across the estate's 9 blocks. Barking and Dagenham Council is the freeholder for them all and has installed itself as the contractor for gardening, but also for rather expensive cleaning. The council says it calculates the cost of caretaking, cleaning the corridors and stairwells of the 9 blocks, by taking the total budget of the council's public realm department, including more than £4 million in salaries, a vehicle fleet costing over £200,000, unspecified overheads of £834,000 and £468,000 in bin rental. It then divides the total cost, £6.1 million, by the number of employees, 89, and charges the Weaver's Quarter residents for 3 of those employees, supposedly meaning 3 full-time cleaners at a cost of almost £70,000 per cleaner. And the residents in this affordable and social housing development are picking up the bill.
So when we moved in 2019, the cost for our service charge was £1,700 a year. We're now expecting that to exceed £3,900 from May next year, despite there being no material change to what's provided and a very poor output, really, in general.
What do you think is behind all of this?
The fees that we're being charged don't seem to be based on any accurate invoicing or logical reasoning. It seems to be a mechanism to help fund other council activities and other things that are being funded in the borough. We're footing the bill for that essentially here through inflated service charges.
Added to the financial concerns are safety ones. The council and their contractors were first warned about dangerous balconies 2 years ago. Last month, another partially collapsed, the 5th so far. The council say 2 other companies are responsible for raising concerns about defects and fixing them. Labour say if they get into government, they'll deliver the biggest boost to affordable housing for a generation, yet their record in this borough is patchy at best. Firstly, building leasehold developments when that's something the party supposedly want to get rid of, and then angering residents with big charges for bad service. The local MP may be Labour, but she's not happy.
We first warned about the lack of safety, the unsafety of the balconies over 2 years ago, and it is really a scandal that it took another collapse of some fascia from the balconies, which could have fallen on somebody.
Margaret Hodge believes the residents of Weaver's Quarter are due a partial refund.
Repairs not done, payments for gardening that with the grass never getting cut, car parking charges, and they're never able to use the car parks because the gates are broken. The list goes on and on and on. And it's a sort of David and Goliath battle with the strong, well-resourced, not very caring council and residents and leaseholders who aren't well off. Leaseholders embarking are not people with mounds of money to play around with. They're often people who are forced into shared ownership or some form of buying because there is no other way they can get a roof over their head.
Are we the best? The man picked to succeed Margaret Hodge as the local Labour MP is the council's leader, Darren Rodwell. He is a rising star, but with a reputation for gaffes. After saying this at a Black History Month event.
So, you might have known that I've got the worst tan possible for a black man, but I have the passion of the rhythm of the African and Caribbean. I used to do swing dance because I used to love jiggling about.
He later apologised for what he called the stupid and embarrassing remarks and the offence caused. Councillor Rodwell attracted criticism for hanging a Darren Rodwell for barking banner on some gravestones. He said at the time he wasn't being disrespectful. The council leader also threatened to evict housing tenants who don't report knife crime. He later said his comments had been sensationalised to make me sound like I was some sort of Mussolini.
I'm proud of our record, but I know I can do so much more as your voice in Parliament.
And in the last 5 years, he's received more than £20,000 in gifts and hospitality, including £12,448.50 in West Ham tickets and hospitality from a single construction firm after they secured permission to build some film studios in the area. The council says all councillors register their interests in the proper way. Darren Rodwell did not respond to requests for an interview with Newsnight, but in a statement, Barking and Dagenham Council said it's proud of its record on affordable housing. Regarding cleaning and gardening charges, the council said services to residents are provided as per their tenancy and lease agreements, which are regulated under the relevant legislation, and administrative paperwork is provided to residents in accordance with the regulations. After being accused of not taking warnings about balcony safety seriously, they said the council has no legal powers to raise concerns about such defects, and they pointed to two companies, one of which the council said had already accepted responsibility for putting right defects, and the other which retains the legal responsibility for managing concerns about the building quality, including latent defects. All this has driven the chair of the Residents' Association to move on and move out.
It's made me now question whether I want to live here anymore, and I've actually taken the personal step of putting my flat on the market because I can't live here anymore. I feel hopeless, I feel like we've been used, ultimately invisible to the council, who have no regard for how we feel about where we live.
As Labour try to build their reputation for good governing, their record on housing, at least in this borough, seems to be on shaky ground.
And Joe is here. I mean, Matt's obviously had enough. He's trying to get out. What about the other residents? Are things going to change for them?
Well, they hope so, but there's no sign so far, Victoria, that the council or its property companies will refund any of those service charges. They may be worried about the expense to themselves or maybe about setting a precedent. But I understand the residents are planning to make an application for something called a first-tier tribunal. It's basically a court that settles these sorts of disputes. You need to show that your service charges are manifestly excessive. And then if the court agrees with you, those service charges can be reduced and backdated too. But of course, even though the application fee is quite small, if you're taking legal advice, that comes with a cost. And especially when we're talking about social housing, affordable housing, not everyone has the money to do that.
OK. Thank you very much, Joe. Thank you. Right, let's take a look at tomorrow's front pages now. Alongside me, as you can see, Lucy Fisher, the Whitehall editor of the Financial Times. Welcome to you. Thank you for giving up your evening to be with us. Right, your paper tomorrow. Sunak heads off right-wing revolt to win the vote on Rwanda migration bill. The Daily Telegraph, Sunak faces down Rwanda rebels. The Guardian, Sunak avoids major rebellion over Rwanda deportation bill for now. And the Daily Mail, Sunak sees off the Tory Rwanda rebels for now. The Eye, Sunak survives Rwanda revolt to set up a New Year's showdown with the Tory rebels. And the Metro, tomorrow, Rishi saves his bacon, a reference to the fact that he had breakfast butties with various of the rebels first thing this morning. So very similar headlines. They think there's still going to be trouble down the track for Rishi Sunak.
Yeah, look, I think broadly a positive set of headlines for Sunak tonight, showing that he has seen down the rebels, headed off the revolt. But yes, that note of warning for now. This emergency legislation will be back in the Commons in mid-January. We know that breakfast meeting today with 15 odd of the would-be potential rebels on the Tory right, it all fell to a certain promise, as they saw it, from Rishi Sunak to tighten the legislation. Now, unclear at the moment whether that means concrete amendments. Certainly those MPs on the right who agreed not to vote against it but abstained tonight believe it does mean that. On the other hand, the other end of the spectrum of the party, you've got the One Nation centrist Conservatives warning that is completely unacceptable to them. So very difficult to see how much room for manoeuvre the Prime Minister has.
What could it mean for Rishi Sunak's premiership as we move into 2024?
Well, I think he's got, to do some creative thinking over the next few weeks. It's really difficult to see an easy way through this because his party is so fragmented and both wings are so entrenched. It feels very tribal in Westminster today. I know you were there too. And although he's won the vote tonight, I do think the events of the day have been a real dent to his authority. We've seen open infighting. We've seen displays of party disunity laid bare. And also some MPs, particularly on the right of the party, accusing the government of dark art tactics, of the whip's office, accusing them of threatening MPs that there would be consequences if they defied the three-line whip and voted against the legislation. I'm told by people close to the whip's office that there was no suggestion made or threat made that MPs would lose the party whip. But clearly there's a lot of turmoil that's been laid bare to the public today, and it's not a good look for the party.
But when you think of the sort of fractious nature potentially of the last few days compared to infighting in previous Conservative governments under previous Conservative Prime Ministers, how does this compare?
Well, interestingly, Sir Gary Streeter, who veteran Tory MP from sort of centrist tradition of the party, who was whip in the dying days of the major government, served this warning to would-be rebels today. Said, "You are driving us towards the abyss. Step back." So those with a long memory who remember what it was like crashing into opposition are just tearing their hair out and trying to encourage colleagues to rein it in, to unify as they head into an election year.
And how important is this policy now when it comes to Rishi Sunak and the Conservative government's electoral fortunes?
I think it's hugely important, in part because it matters to the public at large. It particularly matters to Conservative voters. A statistic I love to trot out because I think it's really instructive is that YouGov, the pollster, tracks the issues most important to the public. Immigration tends to track third, but to those voters who voted Conservative in 2019, it is the most important.
Yeah.
And so that's why Tory MPs describe it as an existential issue for the party. And also the Conservatives, the government have talked it up so much. They've made it all about this in some sense. They haven't left themselves much manoeuvre room to pursue any other policy now. So there's a lot riding on it.
Thank you very much, Lucy. Thanks for being with us. Really appreciate it. Thank you. That's all from us tonight. Faisal is here tomorrow. Have a good rest of the evening.
Hello, we've had no shortage of wet weather over the last few days. It's brought flooding in places.